Welcome to part 3, clever design or more crap. So we've talked about low-end commodities, how they move around, how they're ubiquitous, how they're made, how they're consumed, how they're disposed of. The kind of flip side to all of that is what you might want to call the maker movement. There's other names for it, but it's almost the opposite or the antithesis of crap stuff. Are commodities that are finely crafted or involve kind of clever design, right? That are more than just crudely produced in a factory. There's a really strong case for this kind of production in that it relies on expertise. Craftspersonship, you need to be skilled at making shoes or surfboards or hand making cheese. Small batches, so it can be made to demand, so there's generally less waste. And in fact, small batches is a huge part of the selling point. There's only 20 of these shapes made, or this shoe, or that kind of leather made. So that sort of built-in scarcity means you can sell it at a higher price. Less waste, better for the environment, because you're not making huge amounts based on one group of buyers' assumptions that this season mauve will be the color. And so around the world, then everyone's copying that color and that style, and then a lot of it ends up as waste. Less shipping if it's traveling further, low carbon footprint. I've put an asterisk there because that's not always the case. You can order handmade stuff from the other side of the world. But generally the idea is that there'd be less shipping. If you happen to live in a town or a country where there's not many people making shoes, you kind of do have a problem. But there is that idea. And with certain commodities, place of origin has a huge bearing on how they're valued. Italian shoes, for example, like locally made shoes. And the case for is that they're unique, bespoke, generative of more meaningful relationships between person and a commodity that should last longer. And there's a strong social connection often between the person who made it and the person who consumed it. You often hear people say, I like to be able to buy something from people I know, etc., etc., etc. And we talked a little bit about hipsters and gentrification, and these things are not necessarily in a direct relationship, but you often see them together because the ethos is similar.
I'm thinking about stuff here that might be sold at, say, Olive Tree markets in Cooks Hill, in the Civic Park at once a month, and those kind of bespoke markets. Pergola's set up, you walk around, there's a bunch of people that are making their own trinkets and honey and gin and all this kind of stuff that's craft-based. There's a real craft economy around it. Susan Luckman's work in Australia, she's got a couple of books about the craft economy that kind of speaks to all this kind of stuff as well.
And even things like clothes and things like that,
clothes.
Yeah.
But those places they won't sell clothes, they'll sell a particular style of t-shirt, or they'll sell pants, or they'll sell dresses. It's not like a supermarket where those tents will have a bunch of different stuff in it. It'll be one product that they do well.
Reuse and recycling, because goods are durable, they're well made. So the idea is that you'd reuse them or give them to someone else, have them for a long period of time, which is so different to the more disposable approach of crap, and gives makers access to consumers in an alternative marketplace. Olive Tree Markets is a great example. An alternative marketplace. Never attempting to compete on scale. You're not ever thinking you're going to make 20,000 of an item. You're making a small number. And then you'll make something else in a small number, and you make something else in a small number to sort of push your skills and push yourself. And it's also fascinating how quite common this is, right? I mean, it also sounds like it's not just although the scale of production can be small, you find these kinds of makers and sellers in so many parts of Australia in particular, and in other parts of the world too.
And the rarity and the kind of bespoke nature of it is part of the appeal.
Yes.
This kind of consumption appeals to people that don't want to think of themselves as mass consumers.
Yeah. And you kind of feel good, right? You buy something, I just met this guy who made it. Isn't it cool? Right? And I think that we can't judge that too harshly, but I think we can also see that there are cases against this, So are these real world alternatives to crap? Or are they just things we can buy and sort of put on top like a cherry of our other consumer practices?
Are they distinction versions of crap?
Yeah, they're distinction versions of crap. And should we all have handmade things, recycled things, nice things? Is that possible? Are these accessible to everybody? And by nature, they're not. But who then again? We're back to this. Which kinds of people have the agency to make ethical decisions around consumption? And there's clearly something to design itself. The semiotics of craft and the maker and the design have become pervasive in what we consume. Not just from those kind of small maker items, but even mass-produced objects with large environmental footprints, like IKEA goods, for example, trade heavily on the ideas of design. And so one of the readings for this unit is Harold's reading on Target, and how Target saw how popular design products were crafted design, artisanal design. And there's actually a whole lot of literature. It's almost craft wash you begin to see. Yep. Even McDonald's have artisanal burgers, for example. Yep. And
I think of Kickstarter in this as well as kind of a way of co-opting this kind of quality maker kind of craft, low-end kind of thing, but it's then kind of mass-produced, shipped all around the world. Yeah. And I say that as someone that was kind of addicted to looking at Kickstarter stuff for a while, because I really like the idea of good design and things that might make my life more efficient or whatever, but really, in the end, they tend to be just remakes of things that existed before, or something, with extra things stuck on it. Yeah, it's kind of...
and I think we both recognise our own personal hypocrisy in this. I'm attracted to many of these things too, right? Yeah. So... Harold's really interesting. He talks about how Target has tried to appeal to a new class of consumers through design collaborations. What's interesting, it's trying to get consumers who might spend more to come down to the level of Target in this approach, rather than the opposite of trying to get consumers to come up and buy things they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. And part of the whole argument here is, well, shouldn't everyone have nicely designed things? Isn't that possible? Isn't that the way it used to be in a kind of fictitious and mythologized past? And he asked the question, does Target really democratize design? And he gives two answers, which I think is interesting, because like with many things, things do seem contradictory. He says, well, no, they don't, because to have any real political potential, the process of design itself must be democratized. What they were doing, which is like what a lot of big consumer retailers do, they find a famous or semi-famous designer, or by finding a designer, they make them famous, and they say, Bergstrom Sverensson designed this kettle, and therefore, it's a crafted piece, etc., 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 even though millions were made. That's not asking lots of people how to design a kettle. That's not asking people what they need, but it's putting that I guess, genius weighting on this designer, which a little bit like when we talked about the technology weeks, like the same way the tech entrepreneur has become a very valuable individual in our contemporary society, so too has the designer. Yeah.
I see this too in, say, where Coles or Woolies employ Jamie Oliver to kind of do their ads, to give it some kind of, chef sheen of here's these kind of recipes that you can do, but in the end you're still going to buy tomatoes and meat and stuff.
In a plastic bag. But then he says, well, hang on a minute, there's also a yes answer to this, right? And it's important too that for a lot of academics, it's nice sometimes to be overt, that you don't also have a really clear answer. There are different ways to read something. He says, well, yes, it actually encourages consumers to become conversant in the language of design. And aesthetic capitalism succeeds via the connective mutations, via user-added value. It makes every consumer an inventor of sorts. The point here is that, well, sometimes people are design conversant. And the language of design is when it gets into big mass-produced commodities, it also gives people that license to kind of think, well, okay, I can afford this, I can consume it. What other things can I do? What other things can I look out for? What other pressure can I make in my purchasing decisions that reflects that? So I think he's a bit Miller-esque there in trying to be a bit more generous than just saying, well, of course this makes no difference, people keep buying crap. And this is a very cynical marketing design to sell more kettles. So saying, well, it's probably somewhere in between. If big producers were really pushed to design more of their products with designers, isn't that employing more designers? If they were really pushed to do this, isn't it making things more limited rather than mass-produced, etc., which would be better for the environment? Yeah. But again, he's not sure. Yeah. And I think it's also interesting to think about the idea of when people stop buying crap, and when do you graduate from crap? So an alternative way of thinking about craft and design is the kind of retro-modern consumer identity, a way of differentiating through sophisticated consumption. And we talked a little bit about this, that people move on from crap, and that's an important marker of social mobility. I no longer have to buy the standard one, I can buy the handmade one or the slightly better one. It's like that with food, it's like that with commodities, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. I think people that get wealthy, they stop eating Eagle Boys and get their artisanal pizza for $25. But there's those kind of processes as you can afford to do more things. You maybe still so consume the same kind of products, but you won't drink VB, you'll drink some kind of craft beer that's like $11 a schooner.
And it'd be great if we could name where it came from, what they put in it, etc., 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 because that's able to show off how sophisticated we are with our consumption patterns. Whereas in some parts of the world, maker culture is seen as actually backwards or old-fashioned, right? That's what people are used to. And certain mass-produced items, especially that have come from abroad, are actually the markers of modernity. So being able to buy H&M clothes rather than what the tailor down the road makes is actually demonstrating modernity. Whereas for us, it's flipped over. I don't think it's always that obvious contrast, but there's degrees and a spectrum within that are quite important. And there are more variations. In some countries, a return to locally designed goods is a sign of good taste and discerning consumption and changing patterns. It really depends. And it can also a way to bring in hybrid styles rather than just consuming what flows through low-end globalization. So localizing stuff that comes, a little bit of design on top, etc. You see it a lot in how people take standard IKEA designs and modify them, and often modify them with particularly kind of place-based modifications that suit different environments. On the work I was doing with Daniel Robinson in Thailand, we're quite interested in pirated goods and how it was shaping the city in different ways. And what was really fascinating is a lot of the manufacturers of low-end goods and pirated fakes were saying that Thais don't really buy it much anymore. It's really mostly exported or for tourists. And there's lots of different reasons for that. One is that a lot of Thai people, as the Thai economy and particularly the middle class has grown, want to demonstrate sophisticated consumption in the same way we do. They want to demonstrate they buy stuff that's had some thought put into it, that's been made, that furniture is not just standard, that they get it from somewhere, etc., etc., etc. And in Thailand, what that means is that a lot of it is actually going back to traditional things that actually never really disappeared in some ways. It's just a different class of consumer targets them. And in other ways, it's that actually a whole industry of designers has grown. Part of that is actually to do with government subsidies that really wanted a sort of design and maker culture as a way to generate livelihoods and stop the brain drain, so to stop sort of skilled people and designers leaving the country. And so they actually subsidized a lot of design workshops, design exhibitions, gave a lot of subsidies and grants, etc., for designers to get going. So especially amongst the middle classes, design culture that borrows and modifies styles from elsewhere, incorporates some local styles, etc., has become really, really popular. And key in that is the idea that to be modern is you're moving on from what is mass produced. And so it's interesting that carries on in contexts beyond the West. And finally, back to this idea of graduating crap, is that this shift's also part of like a state-mediated interest in expanding the entrepreneurial class and associated forms of capitalism. So as economies kind of reach a certain point, there is this idea that they've got to find ways to get more local producers, more local design, more local imprints on things. This interest can also be seen in public investment, as I just mentioned. There's a great place called the Bangkok Art and Culture Gallery, which is just full of Thai designers and designer shops. And it actually does give a lot of young people an opportunity to have a ready-made market and audience, etc. But what's really fascinating about it is what it took over. And here we link back to the idea of gentrification. It was built over a park in central Bangkok that was previously occupied by street vendors and the homeless who got moved out, and this very fancy new centre put in its place. And another example is the Thai Culture and Design Centre, also in a high-end mall containing a shop and a museum, highlighting shifts in Thai creativity and design. So now maker culture is read back into a kind of historical context of we've always been great designers and innovators, etc., etc., etc. The Art and Culture Gallery and the TCDC, along with many of the other boutique designer stalls in shops in Siam Square and Chatuchak and these other places, reflects a demand for these goods, but also an aspiration for a certain kind of modernity, and a modernity on par with other hubs of creative industry. We do that kind of stuff here like they do in other creative and interesting parts of the world, other creative cities, for example, to tie into another topic we've had. So to put it another way, a class of Thai consumers and designers has graduated from counterfeit goods, and this shift has actually changed urban spaces because they need spaces to sell their wares. And so the image you have here is of Siam Square, which looks a bit more like, say, Seoul than anywhere else. It doesn't exactly look like New York or London, but it looks like one of those more orderly and organized sort of Asian cities. And this is where a lot of the design boutiques have come. If you look at a picture of Siam Square from the early 2000s or the late 90s, it was all hawker stalls, migrants from Isan in the east of the state setting up small shops, selling fake, selling second-hand clothes. So this shift from crap to designer goods also has spatial effects. It also reorganizes parts of city and has a strong relationship to gentrification and how both authorities, consumers, and in many senses producers imagine the place they live in to be or want it to be like. So there is a certain power and agency to come with the designer class that goes beyond, I think, just the goods.
Look, as a former power station worker, the amalgam of cables there terrifies me. And you see a lot of that kind of stuff where the development happens really quickly. And a lot of the infrastructure kind of has to be thrown together on top of the old infrastructure, and you end up with that kind of cable rat nest of rat king of cables.
And it's interesting how that's remained, but order has been like, you look at that big space, and particularly under periods of military rule, Thai rulers are obsessed with order and ability to be able to move. They don't like things clustered and gathered, because that seems to be unsanitary and old-fashioned and hectic. And so you see this idea of spreading things out. It's really it's really interesting too how these things aren't just about buyers and consumers, but also about where it happens and how they can change. All right, that's it for this unit.